All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us this evening. This is another in a session of Town Green's Planning for Reality series. I'm Greg Federspiel. I'm pleased to be serving as the director of March, which is one of Town Green's new initiatives, which stands for Mitigation, Adaptation, Resilience, and Climate Hub, where we're working with area communities on tackling the challenges posed by a changing climate. So this series really aims to bring important topics related to the challenges that climate change is causing to all of our attention and to hopefully stimulate some good thinking and some motivation to take some action. Um, but before getting into our speaker for tonight, let me turn it back over to Maureen, who has a few announcements to make, and then we'll get to the main attraction. So Maureen, a
Yeah,
few announcements.
thanks, Greg. I just wanted to remind folks that on Saturday at the Sawyer Free Library Community Room from 10:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., we will be having a Red Cross and Town Green Volunteer Information Center. Session so that you can understand what being a Red Cross volunteer is, and it will be focused on creating a community response team for Cape Ann. So hope that you will be able to join us. You can just come and join the session at the Sawyer Free Library at 10:30. And also on Friday, this Friday, we'll have a Town Green team at Source Bakery. So for a climate pop-up, come on down from 9 to 11, have a coffee or tea on us, and chat about emergency preparedness. So thanks so much for those notes on our upcoming program. Back to you, Greg.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Maureen. So
I'm
tonight
sorry,
we're
I'm sorry to interrupt. Where was that on Friday? Because I couldn't understand where, the address.
It's Source Bakery on Duncan Street, downtown Gloucester.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
all right. So tonight we're very honored to have with us Professor Jesse Keenan. Professor Keenan has a impressive bio and has done tremendous work in the field of climate change in a host of different areas. He's the Favrot second associate professor of sustainable real estate and urban planning, and also director of the Center on Climate Change and Urbanism, and director of the Climate Change Science and Practice minor program at Tulane down in New Orleans. And Jesse's research focuses on the intersection of climate change, mitigation, adaptation in the built environment, including aspects of design, engineering, regulation, planning, and financing. Previously, Jesse was in the neighborhood. He was at Harvard, where he worked at the Harvard School of Graduate School of Design, and recently was involved with phase 3 of the Harvard study that was conducted here on Cape Ann, and was able to present a white paper that he worked on for that effort last fall at City Hall. So we're honored to have Jesse back with a focus on his latest book, which is called North: The Future of Post-Climate America. Um, an incredibly well-researched book. I think I counted, Jesse, there are almost 900 footnotes in your book. So an extreme wealth of information for those who want to dive deeper and start looking at all those footnotes. Incredible amount of information. But a pretty simple thesis, though, with a lot of nuance and complexity behind it. And that thesis being that climate change is going to stimulate and has and will continue to stimulate migration in the United States. So the settlement patterns that we have traditionally seen are going to change because of a changing climate. Um, so with that, Jesse, why don't I turn it over to you and let you give us the major theses of the book. And after your presentation, we'll have a discussion and open it up to questions from the audience. Folks who have questions, you can put it in the chat, and we'll also take some live questions as well at the end. We have about an hour together, so we will try to use it as productively as we can. So with that, Jesse, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Greg and Maureen, and the entire the entire town, Bruce and everyone in the TownGreen organization for having me. It's a great privilege to be with you all. I lived in Massachusetts at many stages in my life, from youth, and pay taxes in Massachusetts. I worked for a governor at one point in Massachusetts, and so it's near and dear to my heart. It feels like home, I suppose. And I'll try to do my best to contextualize the broader theses of the book within what's happening perhaps in your backyard now, and then perhaps what's to come. So the title of the book is North, the Future Post-Climate America. It's available on Oxford University Press. You can buy it anywhere, just go to your library. It's probably the best place to get it. The general thesis of the book is that climate change is going to alter and is already altering how and where Americans will live. In this sense, we can think about a geography in America of a geography of risk, but also a geography of opportunity. So we can think about this in three scales. A kind of macro scales that climate is altering our standard of living and our way of life. And we'll talk about that here in a little while in terms of the underlying economic stresses and the amplification that the role that climate plays in further stressing existing stresses that we have relating to housing affordability, accessibility, local taxes, food prices, utility prices, et cetera, our cost of living, if you will. At an intermediate or meso scale, we can think about the role that climate plays in what we call human mobility or climate migration or climate migration for short. And we have an emergent body of observational empirical research that's telling us that people's preferences are changing and that people really are on the move. And we'll talk about who those people are in the context of domestic internal migration in the United States. And finally, at a kind of micro level, this book and the broader theses that we'll explore here, and I'll try to be brief with the ambition of reserving as much time and conversation with you all as possible, is that we are constantly in this process of de-risking our lives and seeking forms of decarbonization, but really just a more sustainable way of life. And these happen not necessarily with climate in the forefront, but allied to a broad array of challenges that shape how and where we live: crime, taxes, school, economic labor opportunity, all of these things. Climate is very rarely a kind of singular factor, but it's on the table with a broad array of conventional metrics and factors rather, that shape where we're going to live. So we can think about the climate's role as push and pull. And on the push ends of the mechanism, we have physical risk exposure, right? These are people who, or the underlying risks associated with fires and floods and all of the things that we can think about in terms of biophysical impacts of climate change. We also have what we call transition risk exposure in some parts of the country where we see changes in the economy associated with broader capital flows to de-risk the economy, for instance. This is more prevalent overseas than it is immediately here in the United States. But I'm just going to turn off someone's camera because they're spinning around and it's making me dizzy watching it. So if you think coal miners, right? We're slowly moving away from coal, or actually rapidly moving away from coal, because the cost of coal-fired energy just isn't competitive with other forms of generation. That's a transition risk. We're transitioning to a decarbonized economy, and that has implications for pushing people out. Again, climate is interacting with a broad array of chronic economic stresses. And finally, a major push factor that I explore in the book. In fact, we could spend the entire hour here today talking about our declines in human health and welfare. And in many areas of the country, there's a sort of unevenness to the implications here, but particularly as it relates to extreme heat, vector-borne diseases, any number of associated implications associated with human health. In particular, wildfire smoke, as you all may recognize, is a significant determinant, and that is shaping people's decisions. It's actually, believe it or not, wildfire smoke is shaping the value of real estate. There's also pull factors. So the push is clear. It's the physical impacts. It's the indirect economic stresses, by and large. It's human health. But the pull factors are also a component of what we think about in terms of people's motivations and preferences. So what are people seeking? They're seeking reduced vulnerability, reducing costs. We'll talk in a little bit about what we see in ecological economics. People are really looking for more moderate ambient weather. And by and large, there's a whole cohort of society that's really trying to seek a more sustainable way of life. And we can define that in a couple of different ways. The problem with what we call the pull factor, or what formally is known as amenity migration, what is pulling people somewhere, it's not particularly well understood. Where people end up, that is, we can think about sending zones and receiving zones. This is the vocabulary I use in the book. Sending zones are areas that are inordinately high risk. They're fundamentally changing. There is an exit of the population. And receiving zones are where people are ending up. Most social scientists agree that most people are moving relatively locally or within a region. They're not necessarily moving across the country, although we do see some of that within our population studies. But nonetheless, understanding what's pulling people is much more difficult, much more empirically challenging than understands what's pushing people. But we recognize it's a combination of the two. So the question is, who is on the move, right? And we can think about that move again from a local relocation all the way to transcontinental climate migration. So we know that it really runs a gambit spatially from very localized, just moving from one part of town to the other, for instance, to people who are already moving across the country. So we can think about a range of cohorts, demographic cohorts that exist. And on one end of the continuum, if you will, we have those that are involuntarily displaced. These are people who have floods their homes are burned or they're flooded. And I think that's clear enough in terms of the underlying implications of what pushes those people to relocate. On the other end of the continuum, we have what we would call preemptive value investors. These are also often rather wealthy people who are thinking about transgenerational wealth transfer. They're trying to build something, very often build a community, or very often make investments to take advantage of the movement of people. So we see a whole class, particularly what we call family offices throughout the United States, that are investing really billions of dollars in a number of major funds that are thinking about preemptively about where people are moving and how they would make more or less money from that in housing and land development and other areas. We have on the another cohort is what we call stress-based sorting agents. And these are people who are more or less making trade-offs between the cost of living and the risk of loss. So these are people who are more or less saying, I am willing to live in a high-risk place in order for a lower rent or a lower cost of living. And so that trade-off is being made. We see this in the literature in sea level rise zones, flood zones, wildfire zones. People are more or less willing to live in a very high risk place in exchange for lower rent. So they're sorting into places. So that's shaping how we see people's movement. We also have circumstantial opportunists. And circumstantial opportunists, who are people who are more or less agnostic as to the role of climate in impacting their consumption decisions. But when presented with information about climate risks, when they are, for instance, shopping to either rent or to buy a home, when presented with evidence or information about either through formal disclosure or through climate analytics, for instance, on Zillow or something like that, they will, between two equal options, will tend to make the decision to de-risk their investment. So we begin to see the role of information, the valuable role of climate-related information in the economy shaping consumer choices. Finally, we have the electively mobile. This is a cohort of people, generally upper income people, who have the wealth and the labor skills, the transferable labor skills. Very often these people are working remotely or have some hybrid work relationship that allows them to be mobile. This is a very, very active and probably the most active area in terms of climate and migration domestically in the United States, are people who essentially are upper income people with the labor skills. And climate is important to them, particularly as they move into child rearing ages and have families. This is a major component of consumer preferences now. And we see this is particularly acute in areas with wildfire exposure, for instance. Flooding, it comes in forms in a lot of different ways, but wildfire exposure for children, increases in asthma, lead exposure, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that are, in terms of environmental exposure, are significantly changing people's preferences. And at this stage, the early stage evidence suggests this is one of the largest cohorts by population today. So how many people will relocate or move? Well, it depends on who you ask. If you talk to demographers, they say, well, people follow fairly predictable mobility patterns. Most of the movement of what we see currently and would anticipate in the future is actually intra-county or relatively localized movement of people. And most demographers are entirely agnostic on international inbound climate migration. And we've seen a fair amount of that in recent years with destabilization in Central America and really globally. Environmental destabilization leads to violence and has interactions with existing mechanisms of domestic or international migration, I should say. So from just an internal point of view, it's viewed as a relatively localized phenomenon among demographers. Among a broader class of social scientists, they really struggle to incorporate adaptation into how they model these things and how they think about the quantifications of it all. Because people are ingenious. We have been ingenious for millennia in maintaining some stability in the civilizations that we've built in ways that are very difficult to model in terms of basic preferences. We have what we call agent-based models, and these are models that were based on machine learning that have taken people's preferences and their different behaviors and sort of aggregated them into types of simulation, more or less. And for the most part, these models are made significant advances, but they're really not ripe yet for supporting policy or planning or anything like that. They're really at a relatively early stage of development, and this is because it's very difficult to scale localized preferences. And finally, if you ask economists say, well, people mostly just follow the jobs. It's really about wage differentials. It's about mobility and the opportunity for employment. There will be some resource-dependent industries. In fact, we've already seen some, particularly water-based resource-dependent industries be on the move. And in fact, interestingly enough, data information in data centers and the economy of AI and everything is actually, as you can recognize, highly dependent on energy and water. And we're already seeing climate risk play a major role in that, and then the associated allied industries that tie into that, for instance. But principally in the area of water-based resource industries, they will relocate, but the way economists see it is that as one industry exits, another, often lower wage industry comes in and fills in behind it. So there's not a tremendous amount of work. There's a lot of competing perspectives ultimately among demographers, social scientists, and economists. So the answer is no one really knows, but it's likely to be in the millions. The most robust evidence that we see out there in the underlying journals and the modeling that suggests that, tens of millions of Americans, well, we're a relatively large country. I believe we're, 342 million people now. So it's a relatively modest amount relative to the whole. But I think it's very important for us to remember that even small numbers of people moving into a community can have enormous outsized effects. So as a localized phenomenon, both the exit of populations, but also the inbound migration of people, it has significant, let's say, risks and opportunities at the same time, or challenges and opportunities. Interestingly enough, about 1% of the U.S. population is temporarily displaced by natural disasters in recent years. Of that 1%, about 500,000 people are permanently displaced every year. That's about the 4 times the relative population that was displaced annually during the Dust Bowl from 1930 to 1940. So this is an enormous amount of people who are being displaced by climate-attributed events, and not all natural disasters are climate-attributed, but there's a step forward in the analysis that looks at climate's role there. And that's impressive because if you think about the role that the Dust Belt, or the legacy that the Dust Bowl had in terms of literature and the sort of cultural ethos of our society, it's remarkable that we haven't had more immediate dialogue on this, because it's a lot of people are on the move. All right, so the question that often comes up, particularly among those who live in Massachusetts, I would imagine, is, isn't everybody just moving to the Sun Belt? And indeed, the Sun Belt did grow because of air conditioning. And in the 1960s and the 1970s, people really did have what we call marginal willingness to pay. The economics literature showed us quite convincingly that people really did want to live in the warmth and the sunshine. Those of you may remember this, in the 1970s, in particular, early 1970s, was extremely cold in New England. And as people were beginning to enter into that first wave of retirement post-war, it actually served as a significant push factor, believe it or not. In the 1980s, though, starting in the 1980s through the 2000s, that's not why the Sun Belt grew. People did not move to the Sun Belt for the sunshine, if you will. What really grew the Sun Belt was cheap housing, cheap energy, by the way, carbon-intensive coal-fired energy, and low-wage non-union labor, and also property tax caps, which I talked about previously among that I think some of you had joined previously at Cape Ann. So a number of different factors led to the growth of the Sun Belt, and it was really ultimately about affordability and wage opportunity, even though those wages were relatively depressed. Now, the end of the Sun Belt era is most certainly upon us, and there's a lot of empirical evidence to support this. One, the marginal willingness to pay, or people's preferences, is increasing for more moderate temperatures and particularly lower humidity. As we are an aging society, we are aging quite rapidly. People become much more physiologically impacted by extreme heat, for instance, and obviously the combination of heat and humidity is a major challenge and determinant for many people. The marginal willingness to pay decreases for hot and humid weather. And so what we see across the body of literature and economics, essentially sunshine has a waning and negative influence on domestic migration. People really don't want to move to hot and humid places. And so if the originating logic of the Sun Belt was, hey, the housing's cheap here, the energy's cheap here, and the property taxes are cheap, well, it's certainly moving in the other direction. On all metrics of the cost of living in the Sun Belt are rapidly increasing. As you can appreciate in Massachusetts, with your own tax caps in the Sun Belt have reached their sort of critical threshold. They now have to significantly increase their tax base to support the growth and to manage the growth that they've had. Energy costs are way up, housing costs are way up. By all measures of housing burdens or cost burdens, there's a dwindling measures of affordability throughout the Sun Belt. And you can see this, interestingly enough, in estimates associated with energy cost burdens through the balance of the century. This is RCP 8.5, so you can take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. Now, interestingly enough, a number of colleagues of mine from the Federal Reserve published some research a number of years ago. And what they showed us here, and this is cross-geographic relationships. So all you need to know here, this is between states. This is blue are the more or less cold states. It's not a perfect measure. It's a slightly different proxy, but this is people moving, and this is a negative number. This is a positive number. So people are moving from cold states to warmer states over time. By the 2000s or in the 2010s, this becomes a more or less statistically nil effect in state-to-state movement. Now, if you look at counties, there's a little bit of evidence, although this is statistically fairly meaningless, but there's some early stage evidence that it's already flipped by the 2010s in the sense that people are beginning to move county to county into cooler counties. This is interesting because in a state like, for instance, Arizona, we know that we've known this for a long time. Arizona is classic for this. People are moving from southern Arizona and they're moving up to higher elevations in northern Arizona. So they're not necessarily moving state to state, but they're moving to higher elevations, which have much cooler temperatures. All right, so this is rural counties, and this is statistically robust. We have seen a significant amount of depopulation in warm rural counties and a significant amount of growth in cooler, much cooler rural counties throughout the United States. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. Climate is part of it, but not by any means a sole or deterministic factor in that regard. What is really important is age. So this is people age 60 to 69. The numbers look very similar for people in their 20s and very similar for people in the 70s. For people, these two ends of the bookends of people in their 20s and 60s to 70s, the migration is well underway. The reverse migration, if you will. People are moving to cooler and cooler states and colder counties and environments. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. One, it's the push factor. People are sensitive in their 20s and as they get close to retirement. They're sensitive. They are on budget. They're on a relatively fixed income, either preparing for retirement or coming out of school. They're trying to think about where they're going to build a home or a community or a forever home, if you will, in retirement terms. And everyone is very sensitive in that context to insured or uninsured risk of loss. And so we see this both in the economics data, but we actually see this in the real estate marketing data. And there's an enormous amount of real estate marketing data that asks people, where do you want to live? Where do you want to live? How? What's your jobs prospects? How are you going to pay for that? I mean, it's really extraordinarily detailed on levels that are really hard to appreciate. And it's all telling us the same thing. And particularly among young people, they are extremely sensitive to climate events for a number of reasons. They really just don't want to plant roots in places that they see as being subject to long-term climate impacts. There's just greater awareness. And on some level, one could argue maybe an overestimation of risk relative to the actual risk associated with climate. We can talk about the difference between actual risk and perception of risk as well. All right, so the reverse flows by region. This isn't in the book. This just came out the other day. A demographer at the University of Virginia sent me this. It was in the Economist. From 2022 to 2025, we've basically seen the Sun Belt, and this is the South, but not perfectly the Sun Belt. Most of the Sun Belt is in the South. We've seen the amount of in-migration domestically cut in half in 3 years. So the Sun Belt is significantly slowing down in terms of in-migration. And interestingly enough, for the first time in over 70 years, we've had a positive migration, domestic migration to the Midwest. The upper Midwest in particular. So this is the beginning of a broader reorientation to our population in this country. Interestingly enough, the young demographer who sent me this note about his work, he also sent me this in an email. My wife and I are moving 30 minutes west of Charlottesville, the Shenandoah Valley, which has noticeably cooler, less humid summers with fewer mosquitoes than Charlottesville. So even the guy who's just a demographer doing this underlying work is himself moving to higher elevations of which mosquitoes, vector-borne disease, humidity are actually playing a role in how they perceive their quality of life. This is a very young guy, and he has the luxury to move so easily. So the idea of the title of North in the book really is an oversimplification, at least in terms of cardinal direction. Most relocations we can acknowledge is local, but at the same time, we have pretty well-defined transcontinental receiving and sending zones. This is, we know people are on the move, and in some cases, people are moving quite broadly. So the push areas and the pull areas are perhaps well understood. The story of Miami, New Orleans, and Phoenix is probably clear enough in terms of the population, but so too is Cape Cod. There is no doubt that Cape Cod is really on the precipice of massive, significant demographic change, particularly as it ages, particularly as healthcare infrastructure begins to exit the Cape. As the healthcare infrastructure moves, so too does a population, particularly an aging population. And there's a lot of signs to suggest that Cape Cod is already in the process of a significant shift. Sorry, just turn off this video because sometimes it's distracting for people who are in character on video for me to have a serious conversation. So that there's the push factor, right? And so in other places, people are moving, and people aren't just moving to the Northeast and Vermont and Detroit and things like this. They're also moving to places like Asheville, Charlottesville, and Nashville. And when we mention Asheville, it's always worth noting that warning, nowhere is safe. Right? There's no such thing as a climate haven. These receiving zones where people are moving into, they're shaped by a lot of different factors. We can't outrun climate. Climate risks exist everywhere. Interestingly enough, Asheville will only continue to be a receiving zone. If we know anything about American post-disaster development, what's already happened, and actually what was already happening well before the flood in Asheville, is that people are coming in, they're tearing down what was there, what got flooded, they regrade the lots, they bring up the base floor elevation, they essentially build planned unit developments where the first floor is floodable, it's usually a garage, they crowd people into townhomes, and they sell it at 2 to 3 or more times the cost of originally, the value of the property that was originally there. So we're already seeing a kind of what we think of as a climate gentrification happening in Asheville, and people are only continuing to move there. And by the way, warning, nowhere is safe. Extreme precipitation is a risk that exists all throughout the country, right? This is some of our work from the National Climate Assessment, or the last National Climate Assessment. So it can rain and pour just about anywhere. It's probably our most immediate proximate risk from climate change is extreme precipitation. So my original inspiration for this book was really ecological range shifting. We know in the Northern Hemisphere that ecological ranges are shifting. By the way, that includes the ranges of vectors and mosquitoes and diseases are also moving further north. But so too are just broadly flora, fauna, and fisheries. For those of you in Gloucester, you certainly understand the implications for fisheries. This is well known, at least for 20 plus years now. So, this is the live oak. This is the range of the live oak. Current observed rain on the left. This is the expansion of that range under RCP 4.5, sort of the current trajectory we're more or less on in terms of climate change. This is the highest incidence of observation of the blue jay now and in the future. This is work of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So at the same time I was thinking about this, we live in these complex socio-environmental or socio-ecological systems. If the environment around us is shifting and the ranges are shifting, wouldn't humans also shift spatially by some measure because of our dependence on environment, natural resources, and the like? Well, as work has shown us in geography, there is a kind of landscape to the human temperature niche. So our species has evolved to find a niche within certain temperature ranges that even like physiologically we exist and can optimize agriculture and our way of life within a certain range of temperatures and humidity. But the real distinguishing factor, of course, is why aren't we following the same or similar patterns of the flora and fauna and the environment around us? It's because we have institutions and we have technology that allows us to adapt. So the question that I explore really throughout the book is, are we adapting? Right? And this, in many ways, this is a book of adaptation science that tries to bring some order to our understanding of how we think about our adaptations to climate change, in full recognition that moving itself is a form of adaptation. So throughout the book, there's a number of major themes that come up in this work, which is, yes, direct impacts are shaping where people are living. Economic costs are also playing a major part of this, right? In the sense that you don't even have to have your flood or a fire destroy your home. The price of climate as it is being transmitted through the economy is already putting stress on you in ways that are shaping your options and your paths for where you're going to end up in life. Another interesting thing is, particularly after in what we call the post-war period, we tend to segregate how and where we live, particularly where we live. And that segregation works along race, class, and other attributes. But one of these attributes is what we call kind of what we would think of as homogenous belief systems, in the sense that as we live around what economists call like-mated agents, we just live around people who look and act and very similar to us. We don't have a great deal of economic or social class diversity. People have their belief systems are highly homogenous. And so we don't have a diversity of thought, right? And this, of course, technology accelerates this. Well, this is okay if everybody around you believes in climate change, then you can mobilize local action, you can mobilize local politics, and we actually see this empirically in a lot of ways. But in other areas where you have entrenched belief systems that just deny climate change, for instance, or deny the science or whatever it may be, we see significant maladaptive behaviors. And we see, particularly in these areas, the increased measures of risk because communities really aren't preparing. They aren't making investments in risk reduction infrastructure. They aren't building a kind of community level resilience. And we actually see a separation of communities in this country driven in part by their belief systems. It's really remarkable. You don't see this really in any other country. A little bit in France, and we can talk about why that is. I explore federal adaptation policy and what we have and haven't done and the real limitations of that. I'm going to breeze over that in the interest of your all's time. At the end of the day, I think it's worth recognizing. I worked for the federal government for a long time. I led federal policy with many other colleagues, but I drove adaptation policy in the federal government in a lot of different ways, starting with the Obama administration, later again through Trump and into the Biden administration. And it's worth recognizing the federal government does a lot and has a lot of ambition, but generally most of the responsibility is state and local governments, as you all understand. And in that context, state and local governments, particularly local governments, have very limited capacity. And what we see is generally a really discouraging set of signs as to how people are preparing. So we ask ourselves, well, are local governments adapting? The answer is mostly no. We have about 90,000 local governments in the United States, many of which are just special purpose taxing districts. But across all of the United States, we have about 500 adaptation plans, so formal climate adaptation plans. Only a few dozen have actually made what we could think of as integrated capital planning and strategic investments in the built environment, or just as a matter of public policy in general. This compares with climate mitigation or decarbonization. About 8% of the U.S. population is covered by a climate mitigation plan. My guess is somewhere around 15, maybe 20% of the US population is covered by a climate adaptation plan. So there's a huge disconnect here. And even those where there is planning and is activity, there's not a lot of strategic investment. In fact, Massachusetts falls into that program with MVP. Massachusetts does a lot of great work, a lot of assessment work, a lot of vulnerability analysis, but really hasn't buckled down yet ultimately. And there's all kinds of politics, which you all can appreciate maybe more than I can. So what I talked about previously when I was in Cape Ann last was this prospect of the climate doom loop. And I'll skip over this. And of course, this is the spoof on Steve von Newberg's urban doom loop, which took place during COVID, where you begin to see a decline. Taxes and cost of living go up, services go up, cost burdens go up, asset values go down, spending goes down, public revenue goes down. It becomes a kind of reinforcing cycle. This was only stopped in COVID. This really happened during COVID. The only way we were able to stop it is spend hundreds of billions of dollars in direct subsidies to state and local governments. And in fact, it is still a problem, believe it or not. But this is a real risk for public finance. And again, I don't want to rehash what I already spoke about in Gloucester last fall. So the question is, markets adapting? The answer is most definitely yes. And so I spent a lot of time in the book talking about how different aspects of insurance, mortgage, housing markets, municipal bonds, and the like. And there's different levels of evidence and different robustness in the evidence, and there's different distributional implications in terms of the immediate costs for us as consumers or taxpayers. But it is broad scale, and it sets up this really interesting challenge where the adaptation of Wall Street, and this is what I argue in the book, is Wall Street's adapting quite quickly. They're heavily invested in the science and technology of risk assessment, for instance, and they are adapting their products and their services, and they're beginning to price these things accordingly. And we're more or less, as consumers, sort of flying blind on a lot of fronts. People are more or less taking advantage and making money off of climate change on the backs of consumers. And I go into that in a great deal of detail in the book. So in the book, I unpack real estate markets and every stage of the value chain and the supply chain of real estate and housing. I get into mortgage markets. I talk about blue lining, the idea that there's our financial service providers are already making decisions about where to invest and where not to invest. They're literally drawing lines around places saying we're disinvesting here. It's too risky for us. I talk about insurance markets, and insurance markets are really interesting. It's not just the home insurance market, it's also the auto market. The auto market is in a world of pain. Just give you a sense of this. When we had Hurricane Ian in Southwest Florida a number of years ago, some of you may have friends or family that live in Southwest Florida after Hurricane Ian. We actually had more auto losses in Florida than we had damage to public infrastructure, if you think about the enormity of that storm. But in a place like Louisiana, about 8% of average take-home pay goes to pay auto insurance. I mean, that's just an enormous cost burden for people in a relatively poor state like Louisiana. So the bottom line is, and we don't need to go through the losses, but the losses are significant. We averaged in recent years certainly well over 130, 145 billion dollars of losses a year in the United States. Interestingly enough, about 40 to 45% of claims in recent years have been hail and hail losses. And they are concentrated in certain parts of the country, but really, 500,000 plus claims a year for hail. And the good news is hail is relatively easy to mitigate. There are changes to roof standards, changes in material. There's the fortified standard for roofs. Fixing the hail problem is relatively doable, but it of course comes at a pretty steep price. Now, what we see in insurance markets, and I bring this up because Massachusetts, I remember sort of predicting this in Massachusetts, and it actually happened exactly the way I predicted it. What's happened is that states are cross-subsidizing. So the insurance companies are cross-subsidizing across state lines, more or less. And so what I anticipated is that there's a lot of wealthy people with relatively high risk, underpriced insurance in Massachusetts. And what I anticipated is we saw greater and greater losses in Texas and Colorado and California and Idaho, and ultimately as well as in windstorm losses in Florida, as they would begin to play this out in terms of limiting coverage, increasing claims denial or increasing declination rates, and basically charging higher premiums in a state like Massachusetts, which hadn't had a major event in a long time, but actually had statistically or empirically a fair amount of risk that was underpriced in the market. And this is exactly what's happened in Massachusetts. They've seen it as a means to cross-subsidize losses in other areas. Now, this gets really interesting because one of the most broken areas of our system, or the in terms of market failure, has been the windstorm market, and this is actually in Massachusetts where we've seen increasing challenges across the board. Now, there has been a movement in the United States, kind of bipartisan movement, to think about something like the National Flood Insurance Program, but for a national wind program. So essentially creating a national wind model. But this is a part of a broader trend in America that's very problematic, where we privatize assets and we socialize liabilities. It's not a strong fiscal position to be in as we move forward. There's all kinds of research that shows us where these insurance increases are been. You can see here in Eastern Massachusetts, significant increases in annualized premiums. Now, this is how we just bet. And by the way, this is 2024 numbers. It looks very similar to 2025. They had a 103% loss ratio in 2024. So that means that they're paying out more than they have premiums coming in. But they had a 39 billion pre-tax operating profit across the industry in the United States in terms of insurance. And the reason that is because they had 75 billion in net investment yields. So here's the situation I set up for us. What happens when we have a down market, right? What happens when private credit tanks? What happens when we revalue private equity assets in the market? What happens when the stock market grossly underperforms? What happens when oil shock inflation? You can see where I'm going with this. What happens when insurance companies stop making all the money that they've made within these various conventional alternative asset classes associated with their investments in the premiums? Even in regulated terms, we're looking at a scenario where we have convergent upside down loss ratios and investment losses. This is a situation you don't want to be in as a consumer. And this is the only thing that has insulated us in recent years from big events, is that the stock market and the economy have been booming and doing quite well. What happens when we have climate hits and the economy tanks at the same time, even in cyclical terms? Right. So this is something that I don't think people fully appreciate. So I'm going to really stop here. I have more to this, and talking about how the private sector, governments, bonds, the bond risk, the implications of bond risks in the economy. We're pricing this in bonds. Let me just fast forward thing, but I think it's really important to say this. We tend to think that, like, through democratic processes, we get to dictate who moves forward and who gets left behind in our own communities, through policy, through planning, through our own maybe activism on some level. But the reality is that, yeah, some people will benefit from federal resources and state grants and things like that. For all those that are displaced by floods and fires and climate impacts, that's a real challenge. But the bigger challenge, as I see it, are the many more people who will be forced to relocate, really at the hand of the market. And we already see this happening throughout the United States, particularly in the Sun Belt, where cost burdens are driving people's change in consumption and limiting their decisions. So we have this kind of geography of risk and emergent areas of risk. And there's a lot of different ways to read through that. So I'm just going to wrap it up here because we've run a little bit out of time, and I wish I could go on and talk about where people are moving. It is worth noting that the final chapter of the book is a work of fiction. It's the year 2079. What would happen if we went all in on something like a climate credit score, where our credit, where we have a social form of credit like they have in China that tracks our consumption and our behavior, and we get penalized for our carbon intensive behavior. So in the Cartesian plane of rights and responsibilities, what if we went all in on responsibilities? What happens if we continue to do what we're already doing in terms of the privatization of infrastructure? How would that shape our geography? How would it shape our political reorganization? In the final fiction chapter, the state of Florida separates into the state of North Florida and the state of South Florida by virtue of a fiscal collapse from some poor decisions that are actually being made in real life today in the state of Florida. So this is the new geography of risk and opportunity, and it has huge implications across the country. And we can romanticize this, but what we really need is to begin not just an escape plan, but really to think constructively, as you all have been, on adaptation planning, because the precarious nature of our life is quite significant. Markets are moving much faster than people can keep up. And there's a lot of promise. I mean, our changing behaviors, we're doing things to de-risk our lives, and that's good, but there's an enormous peril for those who more or less are immobile. So for as much as this evening I've talked about mobility, you can recognize those that are deeply immobile and have limited choices in where and how to live their lives. So this is the book, and for me, it's actually fairly it's not opportunistic in a developmental sense, but it's really actually try to be optimistic because there is a lot of options. There are a lot of things that we can do and work together, and I think TownGreen represents the best of that across our country. So thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry for this accelerated conclusion, but I really want to have the opportunity to hear from you all. So thank you very much.
That's great, Jesse. Thank you. Thank you. We really appreciate you taking this time and walking through, as I say, a fairly simple thesis, but a lot of detail and complexity behind it all. And you certainly have emphasized that even through a quick walk through a lot of the detailed information that the book contains. I want to pick up on that theme at the very end there, that you do hold optimism in that this is an opportunity to sort of have a redo on how we develop, and if particularly those areas that are likely receiving zones,
Hmm.
if they prepare for that
Yes.
and get ahead of that curve,
Yes.
then there's an opportunity to have a sort of a second chance at
Hmm.
creating communities that are more sustainable, that do work
Yes.
better.
Yeah.
Want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, I glossed over that general thesis in the book, but that is an important part of it. And in fact, this is already happening. There are communities and cities. Some of these are led by regional economic development agencies. Some of these are ground up grassroots organizations. Some of these are mayors with a bold vision. But they recognize the opportunity for inbound domestic migration. And some of this is frankly built on people who've already been doing work on inbound international migration and even refugee settlement. They've actually shifted their focus and their theme to say, listen, we've been helping people and foreign immigrants into resettle in our country and integrate in our society, but there's actually a domestic migration happening. And so they've actually shifted their sort of cooperation with economic development agencies and firms and labor and job training and everything else that it takes in terms of developing the social fabric for accommodating people on the move. And we've actually seen that transition is happening in real time. So communities are coming at this from a lot of different angles, and it's sort of dependent, on the size and scale of a city versus a small town. For some, areas that have seen significant depopulation, any amount of people that move there is good for the economy, right? It's good. And it has its growth pressures and strains. But in other areas are trying to develop a labor force or a job, develop an employment force. Others are just trying to attract capital to reinvest in an aging housing stock, invest in a local downtown to, the kind of classic, I wouldn't say urban renewal, urban redevelopment model that we've seen about, in fact, look at the Wall Street Journal today, Cleveland. And look in the front story in the Wall Street Journal about how Cleveland's been doing basically condo conversions of office and retail spaces, and it's been a massive success in bringing people downtown. Well, that's not a climate story, but it also kind of is, because a lot of these people that are moving into these, particularly these Midwestern areas, are younger people. They're used to urban living in New York. They're in San Francisco, for instance, and so they have expectations of the kinds of amenities and way of life and what it means to walk somewhere versus driving somewhere. That has massive implications for downtown. So for me, when I go to a place like Gloucester, as someone who lived in New York forever and lived in downtown Boston or whatever, it has like all of these amenities and urbanistic qualities and a way of life that's quite attractive. But then you look for the housing in between it, right? You kind of fill in the gaps and you start doing a kind of basic retail analysis. Anyway, all of these things are interconnected, as you all recognize. And the future of our cities, the future of foot traffic and retail and small town America is deeply tied to just people, particularly in the context of an aging society. So this is increasingly well understood in the United States. And climate is just one of these factors that's changing these preferences that people have on how and where to live.
Yeah, I think as part of some of that Harvard study work, identified some, I'm gonna get the number wrong, but it's in, 1,200, 1,300 homes that are in the flood zone, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So should we be anticipating that and identifying where 1,300 homes could get built elsewhere?
Yeah, and it's also shifting the tax base. So there's a lot of jurisdictions who are saying, okay, well, we know this is a disproportionate amount of our tax base. How are we going to shift that tax base over time in full recognition of the underlying devaluation of those properties and or our ability to service them or whatever it may be. So it's that activity is also happening throughout the country. But also among those 1,400 households or whatever it is, how many of those people could or would want to live downtown, for instance?
Right.
And that, in fact, in California, that has been a real impetus, actually, is a kind of urbanization, even in small towns, to build more infill housing in downtown areas for people who are in the periphery. So it's very interesting because it's not really about climate. These are things we've been talking about in urban planning and urban development and
Sure.
real estate for a very, very long time.
Yeah. Laura, would you like to ask your question orally with
Hi,
the,
hi, Greg. Yeah, thank you. Can you all hear me okay on the
yeah,
audio?
it's
Yes,
fine.
yes, thank you.
Hi, Jesse. Thanks for a super interesting presentation. I'm thinking about heat. It's something I work on a lot in my work, and I am in the city of Cambridge, so they're quite, I would say, advanced with their adaptation planning, but heat is and they're thinking about it through urban forest and those kinds of things. But flood is fairly straightforward to map and to visualize. People can observe it, but heat is more amorphous and also
Hmm.
much more dependent on microclimate. So
Hmm.
I'm wondering, what you're seeing so far in your studies about how municipalities and other planning agencies are taking on heat.
Yeah, so there's a lot of work in heat, and you've seen of course, the appointment of chief heat officers in Miami and Phoenix and other areas. I mean, there's two ways to slice heat, at least two ways. One is in terms of emergency response and public health, in terms of what it means for rapid cooling stations, what it means to mobilize communications and warnings for people in event in terms of extreme heat, particularly when in a brownout extreme heat scenario, a convergent scenario where you lose electricity, and in reaching people who don't have access to cooling or air conditioning, right? So there's the kind of public health emergency response aspect. The other aspect of it is ambient conditions, as you cite, and so urban canopy, but also doing things that change the albedo of surfaces locally, changing building codes for passive survivability within housing. So when the power does go out or air conditioning isn't effective, there's a lot of convergent things there with energy efficiency in general and housing retrofits. But so that these are two well-known lines of work that are happening. I think what's more interesting in my mind and what I think is represented in this book is that, we published some research recently on looking at the people's perception of heat versus the risk of heat. And the biggest gap between perception and reality is not in the Southwest or the Deep South. People are actually pretty well adapted, even physiologically. When you live in the Deep South, your skin changes. It becomes more elastic and it loses heat faster. And also we have behavioral responses to extreme heat. So we're better prepared living in the South. But actually, the biggest gaps is like Appalachia. It's like in the Northeast. This is like a real risk of it's a real public health risk because people just don't perceive it. They just don't have the experience with it. But I will tell you, in my mind, one of the biggest impacts of extreme heat is on an aging society. It is more difficult to live your life the older you get and to manage changes in temperature. And extreme heat has all kinds of implications, not just in terms of comfort levels and ambient comfort conditions, but also in terms of dehydration, kidney performance. I mean, it has really systematic implications. Blood pressure, intraocular pressure, and extreme heat. I mean, all of these things are really connected, and we're starting to learn more and more about these interactions. In fact, the interactions between extreme heat and air pollution, and particularly as we have more humidity in the air, air that can handle more particulates. So we're, I think, getting a better recognition, both clinically and academically, about the role that extreme heat plays in diminishing the quality of people's lives and health outcomes. And older people who are retiring, who are on the move, who are making choices, are working the other direction. I was just telling Greg before this started, I was just doing a book tour in Canada, and one of the things that stood out to me in Canada, that among people that I was talking to, was that there's been Canadians who've been living in Arizona and Florida for decades, and they're moving back to Canada in very large numbers. Now, big part of this is politics, but another part of this is actually climate. And so in Canada, they're struggling to have all these Canadians move back to Canada. They're struggling to build senior housing, the healthcare facilities. Obviously, we have very different healthcare here than they do in Canada in terms of supporting an aging population. So they're in a mad rush, and heat has been a major factor in this, particularly in the Southwest. So it's shaping, I think, our quality of life in ways that is unique. So anyway, I could go on and on and
Yeah,
on,
that's
but
great. And
it's very important.
I'm seeing the response that you're talking about, like the emergency response, but I'm seeing less of it in, development planning in the way that flood resiliency is really getting baked into projects now.
Yeah.
Heat, I think, is less.
Yeah. Well, frankly,
Yeah.
passive survivability in buildings, and from a development point of view,
Yeah.
is codified in California. But frankly, it should be codified in Massachusetts. But that's only going to buy you so much time, right? It's really a time factor, and it disproportionately benefits people who are relatively immobile or have disabilities or aged or whatever. So there's a certain portion of the population that benefits from that. But yeah, there are things that you can and should be doing as a matter of public policy.
Thank you so much. I see there's some other questions, so I'll give back the mic.
Yeah, one of the questions, Valerie Nelson, who you've interacted with, Jesse, quite frequently, she asked about the Iran war and the crisis there and the shift in fossil fuel costs and the global economy being in trouble. Is that shifting any of your analysis that you've done? Is it consistent with what you were thinking all
Well,
the
it
time?
certainly amplifies parallel economic stresses, right? And certainly reinforces the value of investments in renewable energy, home batteries. I mean, managing the utility and energy side of our economy and our household budget. So, I mean, it just accelerates something that's a broader trend in terms of chronic stresses. And it also accelerates the risk of economic populism as a political mechanism, right? So it's a double-edged sword, as I see it. But EV sales are through the roof. Yeah, the renewable energy and sustainability generally benefit from higher oil numbers. So this has real implications in our economy. And the more stress we have, at some point in time, people begin to break. And that's what we see as a threshold.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. You mentioned people leaving Cape Cod.
Yes.
Is it because of the threats of flooding that people are
Yeah,
responding
Cape
to?
Cod's, what you see is a class and economic stratification in Cape Cod that's 50 years in the making, right? Where people, second home market, crowds out locals. The local economy diminishes with time, becomes less diversified, particularly in manufacturing, becomes more reliant on Air Force Base in terms of public sector side of the equation and just service side tourism. And the tax base in a lot of these jurisdictions is, is it indeed they've reached development growth capacity. So their capacity to keep churning the tax base through growth is hitting a wall. And at the same time, particularly in the healthcare side of things, they're losing capacity for healthcare. Providers are leaving, healthcare facilities. Basically, their operational costs are too high, and the labor costs are too high on the Cape. And once the healthcare starts to move, keep in mind the healthcare is the major economic employer in our economy. If you took out healthcare and out of the labor economy right now, we would have had 4 or 5 years of negative labor growth. It's almost entirely driven by healthcare. And we get a little bit of bumps in construction with AI development and things like that, or energy data center development. But it's disproportionately impacted. And so you have an aging society, it relies on localized healthcare, and the healthcare moves out, people follow behind it. And we this isn't just happening in Cape Cod. We see something quite similar in Charleston, and other places in the country where once healthcare begins to move, people do follow.
Mhm.
I mean, do you want to live on Cape Cod as an 80-year-old and drive off the island over the bridge or bridges to go to a primary care physician appointment?
Yeah, not very attractive.
I'm not saying, Greg, you're 80 or 80. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
like, someone who's going to the
No,
doctor's
yeah,
appointment every few months.
we all get there. We all get
Yeah.
as I have my cataract surgery coming up. But anyways,
But it is healthcare amenitization in the housing market is real,
yeah.
and it has more and more power over our economy. People want to live relatively close to healthcare amenities, and healthcare amenities are very, particularly for long-term capital deployment in facilities, are very sensitive to physical risks.
You talked about, we're needing to wrap up here pretty soon. You talked about, government struggling to find sort of that sweet spot,
Hmm. Hmm.
where they are spending enough on resilience and adaptation and, and other measures, um, to stay ahead of the curve, but not so much that they're bankrupting themselves,
Yes, right.
um, but
Yeah.
enough so that they're not falling behind.
Yeah.
Do you have strategies to help government do a better job on finding that sweet spot?
Yeah, I mean, this has been mixed signals as I see it from credit rating agencies more than anything, who've said exactly as you cite, you should be making these long-term capital investments, but also you should be saving up for, cash reserves for a rainy day fund. At the same time, you got to do both at the same time,
Right.
right? And they've not really been, I would say, analytically consistent in their communications with officials about um, about how one really underwrites or evaluates this risk and how one should prioritize strategic investments and disinvestments. So really, I think some of those communities that have thought strategically about disinvestment, like Miami-Dade County, Florida, for instance, have benefited greatly because it helps them triage their assets in terms of asset management and triage where they prioritize their dollars. And I think a lot of communities are trying to do everything at the same time. They're trying to maintain a kind of status quo without being explicit to people as a political exercise about, hey, there's some things that we are just not going to invest in. In fact, we're going to go for strategic obsolescence here. And we're going to shift in a different direction, even spatially. And by the way, we're going to line that up with our zoning and planning and everything else to coordinate that. Jurisdictions are doing that in large part. Again, this comes back to the disadvantage of Massachusetts we were talking about the other day in terms of county government. In jurisdictions that are doing that, for instance, in Florida, they benefit from the counties leading that and taking the localized backlash against it. But in Massachusetts, you obviously don't have that insulation from county level government to help coordinate that because it does require coordination between local governments to effectively have strategic obsolescence and strategically disinvest in certain areas and double down on where you're going to invest. That's, in my mind, the most difficult conversation to have, but it's the most rewarding in terms of how the market views what you're doing as beneficial in the long term.
Mm.
Because right now everybody's trying to have it all. And we fully acknowledge that you can't have it all. Just on the operating expenses associated with, it's just on
Yeah.
OpEx alone. Forget capital expenditure. Just look at OpEx and you can't have it all.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And by the way, you can't have it all in the context of property tax caps, right? And I think you all saw the article in New York Times, South Hadley, Massachusetts, 50% increase. Yeah, I mean, you all know the property tax cap politics in Massachusetts, but this is really hitting the Sun Belt hard because they were grossly undertaxing themselves for a long time.
Right.
You're going to pay for it one way or the other.
Yes. Indeed we do. Indeed we do. Is there a last call for other questions? Burning questions someone would like to ask before we sign off? It's been a quick hour plus. It goes fast. But it's been very enlightening. I hope people have enjoyed it. I know I have, and very much appreciate your time with us, Jesse, and a fascinating book. I highly recommend it if people haven't read it yet. It's I downloaded it on Kindle, so it was an easy read on the Kindle.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you all, and thank you for the work that you're doing, not just in Gloucester, but really across Cape Ann. So thank you for the inspiration and the opportunity to join you.
Very good. Well, I know that you've got a toddler waiting for a bike ride or two, hopefully, if it's still
Yep.
out there.
Yep. I better get going before it gets dark.
All
Thank
right.
you all. Take care,
Thank-
everybody.
Thank you, and take care, everyone. And we hope to see you at upcoming events, as Maureen had indicated. And we appreciate your support and engagement with these series that we are able to provide. So have a good night and enjoy the rest of the evening.